Hands trembling, Cade slammed the override tool against the manual release panel. Sparks flew, and the doors groaned open, just as the Omnith surged forward. Engineering, main reactor core. They barely made it inside. As soon as the last of them passed through, Voss slammed the emergency lockdown, sealing the doors. The thick blast shielding hissed as it engaged. But they all knew this wouldn't hold forever. Engineering was still intact, for now. The reactor thrummed at the heart of the chamber, its energy fields humming with barely contained power. The air smelled of ozone and coolant, and the flickering overhead lights cast long shadows across the control consoles. Sorev turned to Voss. "Tell me we have a plan." Voss's mind raced. He looked at the Zephyrin. "How did your people fight them?" The alien let out a slow, defeated exhale. "We did not. We ran. We hid. And when that failed, we died." "Not helpful," Falk snapped. The Zephyrin's mandibles twitched. "I told you before. They do not attack in the way you expect. You cannot kill them with weapons. They do not exist in a way you understand." Voss turned to the reactor core. Power, energy, everything in the ship ran through this room. If there was one place left where they could fight back, it was here. He looked at Cade. "Can we overload the core?" She blinked. "You want to blow the ship?" "I want to give us a chance. If we can force an energy surge, something big enough to disrupt whatever the hell they're doing to the ship, maybe we can break their hold." Cade's expression was tight, but she nodded. I think I can create a pulse strong enough to destabilize them." Voss turned to the others. "We hold this room until she gets it done." Then, the lights died. Not flickered. Died. Total blackness swallowed the room. The air grew still. Then, from the darkness, a voice. Not human, not alien, something far older. "You misunderstand." The shadows moved, and they were not alone anymore. Final stand. The Omnith did not attack in the way the crew expected. They did not charge. They did not fire weapons. They arrived. One moment, engineering was empty. The next, it was not. Shapes shifted, at the edge of perception. Space folded, twisted, and from those distortions they emerged. Not creatures, not machines, but wrongness. And then, they spoke, not in words, in concepts. A presence pushed against their minds, pressing into their thoughts. Like a hand molding wet clay, the human brain was not designed to hear them. "We are not your enemy," Voss gritted his teeth, forcing the voice out of his skull. "You sure as hell aren't our friend." The Omnith did not answer with sound. Instead, the walls shifted. The air grew thick, and reality itself began to dissolve. Cade screamed as blood ran from her nose. The Zephyrin collapsed, gasping. Voss fought against it, fought to stay in control, to hold on to who he was. And in that moment, he understood. The Omnith were not attacking. They were assimilating, rewriting the crew, the ship, the very idea of what they were into something new. Something not human. Something that would never be human again. "Unless—" "Cade!" Voss roared. "Do it!" Through sheer force of will, Cade slammed the final override. The reactor surged. Energy flooded the ship. And for the first time, the Omnith screamed. The lone Zephyrin in their group shook his head, mandibles clicking in fear. "No," he whispered. "Those are theirs." A sound came from ahead, a wet, slithering scrape. Voss raised his rifle just as the thing emerged from the corridor ahead. It was worse than the ones on the Zephyrin wreck. Where the first Omnith had looked vaguely insectoid, twisted but recognizable, this was something else. It didn't walk. It flowed. Its limbs weren't fixed. They shifted, stretching and reforming with each motion, as though space itself couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. And worst of all, it had faces. Not one. Many. Half-formed human visages twisted across its body. Open mouths locked. In silent screams, as if trapped in an eternal moment of terror. Voss didn't hesitate. "Fire!" Plasma bolts lanced out, striking the entity squarely. But it didn't die. The plasma burned away one layer, and something else emerged beneath it. A new form, a new adaptation. The Zephyrin let out a choked, horrified sound. You cannot kill it like that. It learns. It becomes whatever you use against it. Then what the hell do we do? Falk shouted, firing another burst. The creature twitched, then mimicked her voice perfectly. Then what the hell do we do? The echo was horribly distorted, overlapping, crawling with unnatural resonance, and then it moved. Not forward, not backward, but through the space between them, as though it had always been there, just waiting to be seen. Voss grabbed the Zephyrin and ran. Move! They barely made it past the shifting bulkhead before it collapsed behind them, cutting off the entity's pursuit. For now. Engineering was near, but the ship was changing. The walls pulsed. The decks beneath them shuddered, as if the horizon itself was becoming something not human. And deep within the ship, somewhere in the distance, something spoke. A voice that was not a voice, an echo of reality itself, bending to something older, darker, beyond comprehension, and it said, "We see you." The UES horizon was dying, or worse, becoming something else. As Captain Elias Voss led the survivors through the collapsing corridors, the ship twisted around them, the once familiar metal decks shifting like living tissue. Lights flickered, and the very walls seemed to breathe in slow, unnatural rhythms. Their path to engineering was no longer a straight shot. It was a labyrinth. "This is impossible," Sorev growled, his breathing heavy as he checked his rifle's charge. "The ship's layout is wrong. I've run this deck 100 times. This hallway shouldn't even be here." Lieutenant Cade's face was tight with fear as she checked the map on her wrist console. The display glitched, distorted, warped. Sections of the horizon's schematics rearranging themselves in real time, as if some unseen force was rewriting the ship as they moved. "We have to keep moving," Voss said, forcing them forward. "Engineering is close. If we reach the core, we might still have a chance." But even as he spoke, he knew the Omnith were not simply hunting them. They were infecting the ship, warping it into something else. Something that could no longer be classified as human technology. And they were running out of time. Deck 3. Engineering Access Corridor. The emergency lighting pulsed erratically, casting grotesque shadows along the bulkheads. The air felt thick, suffused with an electric charge that made their skin crawl. Then the sounds started, not just the mechanical groans of a ship in distress. Whispers, muffled voices. They drifted from the darkness ahead, overlapping, distant, yet impossibly close. Some were familiar, others were not. Voss. The captain froze. The whisper was right behind him, too close. He turned. Nothing there. Falk swore under her breath. "I don't like this. It's messing with our heads." The Zephyrin survivor, barely able to stand, let out a dry, hollow rasp. "It is not a trick. They are testing you." "Testing what?" Sorev demanded. The Zephyrin's mandibles clicked in a slow, deliberate movement. "Your sense of reality. If they can unmake your mind, they do not need to kill you. You will simply become." A cold weight settled in Voss's chest. They reached the final bulkhead before engineering. It was still intact, but the door controls were dead. Cade cursed, pulling out a manual override tool. "I need a minute." They didn't have a minute. The whispers grew louder. Then, something moved at the far end of the corridor. Not like a creature walking, more like a shadow detaching itself from reality. Voss's grip tightened on his rifle. "Cade, we need that door open." She didn't answer. Voss turned. Cade was standing still, staring. Her face was blank. Empty, like she wasn't there anymore. Voss grabbed her, shook her. "Cade!" She blinked, then screamed. She staggered back, shaking violently. I saw—" Her breath came in ragged gasps. "They were inside me, I could feel them. Get that door open," Voss ordered. Not blocked. Not obscured by an energy field. They were simply not there anymore. Like the horizon was no longer in the same reality it had been moments ago. "We're still moving, right?" Sorev asked, his voice unusually tense. Carter nodded quickly. "Engines are still firing, sir. We should be accelerating at full burn. But..." He hesitated, checking his instruments. The distance to the system's edge hasn't changed. A silence settled over the bridge. They were trapped. Then, the comms crackled. Not a message, a sound. Chittering. Scraping. A hollow, guttural noise, deep and layered, as though many mouths spoke at once. Voss's skin went cold. That's coming from inside the ship. The bridge crew barely had time to react before the first alarm blared. Hull breach. Deck 5. Then another. Hull breach. Deck 3. Then another. Intruders detected, and suddenly, Voss understood. The Omnith didn't need to fire weapons. They had already gotten inside. The alarms screamed through the corridors of the UES horizon like a dying animal. Red emergency lights pulsed against the metal walls, casting long, shifting shadows as the ship's crew scrambled to respond. Hull breach, Deck 5, hull breach, Deck 3, intruders detected. Captain Elias Voss moved before his mind could fully process what was happening. He turned sharply toward the bridge security panel, slamming his palm against the control surface. A holographic schematic of the ship flickered to life. It showed black distortions spreading like a cancer from the breach points. Not fire, not decompression, something else. "Seal those decks now," he ordered. Lieutenant Cade's fingers danced over the console, but the screen glitched violently. The sections of the ship that should have been sealed refused to comply. I'm trying," Cade stammered. "The system isn't responding. It's like the ship doesn't recognize those decks exist anymore." Voss turned toward the comms panel. "Marine teams, report, static." Then, "This is Lieutenant Gray. We have hostiles on Deck 5. Jesus Christ, they're..." A scream. Gunfire, a wet, crunching sound. The comm line cut out. "Shit," Falk breathed. "They're inside." The Omnith had breached the ship, not with torpedoes, not with boarding pods, but by rewriting the rules of reality itself. Sorev's face was tight with tension. "We need a full lockdown. Bulkhead override. Force seal all sections leading to critical systems." "I told you," the Zephyran survivor's voice cut through the noise. He was slumped against a bulkhead, his mandibles twitching weakly. "I warned you. You cannot run. You cannot fight them." Voss turned to him sharply. "Then what the hell do you suggest we do?" The Zephyran struggled to breathe. "Your weapons are useless. Your walls mean nothing. You must think beyond the material. That is how they hunt. They do not breach. They infect. They do not kill. They consume." His eyes, wide, black, reflecting the dim light, fixed on Voss with something akin to pity. "You brought humans here to save my people, and now we are both prey." The ship lurched. The artificial gravity hiccuped again. The lights dimmed and pulsed. Then came the sound. A deep, chitinous scraping against metal, layered with an unnatural resonance, as if the ship itself was being rewritten into something that did not belong in this reality. "Contact starboard passageway." A Marine's voice crackled over a nearby emergency comm panel. "Multiple entities." A horrible, gurgling shriek. The feed cut out. Voss didn't wait. "Arm up, now!" Weapons were drawn. The bridge crew was not supposed to engage in direct combat, but under these circumstances, no one questioned the order. Plasma rifles, sidearms, even old kinetic shotguns were grabbed from the emergency lockers. Sorev's expression was grim. "Where do we make our stand?" Voss didn't hesitate. "Engineering. If they take the reactor, we're dead. If they take life support, we're dead. If they reach navigation, we're stranded." "They're already on Deck 3, Falk said, glancing at the map. "Engineering's one deck down. If we don't move now, we'll be cut off." Voss turned to Carter. "You, stay here. Keep trying to get the ship's systems back online. If we lose the bridge, you are the last line of defense between us and total shutdown." Carter swallowed but nodded. "Understood, Captain." The rest of them moved. They had one chance to make it to engineering before the ship was overrun. Corridor C-12 was wrong. Voss knew it the second they turned the corner. The walls bulged, unnaturally, as though something had stretched the metal like soft clay. The air felt heavier, the artificial gravity fluctuating in strange pulses. Then there were the marks. Deep, etched symbols lined the walls, not cut by tools, but grown, as if something inside the metal itself had shifted. twisting into unreadable runes. Falk took a shuddering breath. "Are those Zifferin?" she asked. The Omnith slammed against the sealed door, their clawed limbs scraping against reinforced steel. The sound reverberated through the floor, through their bones. The Zepharan survivor, still shaking, turned his gaze to Voss. His voice was hoarse. "You do not understand. That was only one of them." Voss stared at the sealed hatch. The metal dented outward. They weren't safe. They weren't safe at all. On the bridge of the horizon, Commander Sorev watched the status display with grim tension. The boarding team's vital signs had spiked, and the ship's external sensors had picked up strange anomalies inside the Zifferin wreck. Then came the comms burst. "Get us the hell out of here!" Voss's voice was sharp, urgent. "Now, Sorev, now! Bring them in!" Sorev snapped to the crew. "Retract the docking tube. Prepare for immediate departure." The horizon's thrusters flared, the ship pulling away from the collapsing wreckage as the docking tube disconnected. Then the sensors screamed. A new energy signature appeared. Not Zepharan. Not human. A ship. No. Many. They had company. The Omnith were no longer lurking. They were here. The UES horizon trembled as its engines roared to life, burning hard to escape the Zepharan wreck. The docking tube retracted just in time, sealing with a dull thunk as the last of the boarding team stumbled onto the deck. "Get us clear!" Commander Nathan Sorev barked, his voice a sharp command cutting through the chaos. "Engage emergency thrusters. Now!" The bridge crew sprang into action. Pilot Ensign Carter's hands flew over the controls, overriding standard procedures to reroute power directly to propulsion. Thrusters firing, breaking away at maximum burn. The horizon banked hard, its massive frame shuddering under the sudden acceleration. The Zifferin ship shrieked apart behind them, its already failing structure collapsing as unseen forces from within tore through bulkheads and walls. But the wreckage was no longer their primary concern. The Omnith ships had arrived. At first, they didn't appear as solid objects. They registered on the sensors as shifting masses, fluctuating between matter and something else, their forms distorted by unnatural gravitational fields. Then, one by one, they solidified. Dark shapes against the void. Sorev's breath hitched. "What the hell are we looking at?" Lieutenant Cade's fingers danced across the sensor array, trying to make sense of the readings. "They're warping in and out of physical space. I can't get a lock on their exact composition, but..." A pulse rippled through space. The lights on the bridge flickered. Every screen glitched for a fraction of a second. Cade's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're scanning us." Voss staggered into the bridge, his pressure suit still smeared with Sykes' blood. "Report!" Sorev barely looked at him. 5 ships, closing fast. They just came out of nowhere." Voss took a step forward, his gaze locking onto the external display. The Omnith vessels loomed in the distance, jagged, ever-shifting things, as though reality itself struggled to decide what they should be. They had no visible propulsion, no obvious weaponry, and yet the way they moved, as if sliding through space rather than flying, sent an instinctive alarm through his body. "Are they charging weapons?" Cade shook her head, uncertain. I don't think so. I'm not detecting anything conventional." Voss clenched his jaw. "That's not comforting." Another pulse rocked the ship. This time the bridge lights dimmed noticeably. Static hissed across the comms. "That's not a scan," Falk said, stepping forward, her face pale. "They're trying to interfere with our systems." A third pulse. Sparks burst from a console. The ship's artificial gravity hiccuped, causing the crew to lurch slightly before stabilizing again. "Shields at 60%!" Cade shouted. "I don't even know how! We're not being hit by anything physical!" Sorev's hands tightened into fists. "Orders, Captain?" Voss exhaled sharply, his mind racing. The Omnith had not fired a single shot, but they were already winning. He had seen what they did aboard the Zifferin wreck. They didn't simply destroy, they overwrote. "We're not waiting around to find out what happens next," Voss said, his voice firm. "Full power to engines. Get us out of this system. Now." Carter nodded, sweat glistening on his forehead. Plotting fastest escape vector. The Horizon's main engines flared, the ship surging forward at breakneck speed. The Zifferin survivor collapsed into a seat, gasping. You cannot run. They will. He coughed violently, his body still weak from oxygen deprivation. But before he could finish, the stars around them blinked out. The bridge fell silent. Cade's hands trembled as she stared at the readings. That's impossible. Voss turned, his stomach twisting with an instinctive primal dread. What? She swallowed, hard. The stars, Captain. The ones behind us. They're gone. Not footsteps, not machinery. Something that scraped, that clicked, that chittered. Voss's gut went cold. From the darkness ahead, deep within the ruined ship, something shifted. And then the screaming began. The sound that crawled through the ruined corridors of the Zifferin vessel was unlike anything Captain Elias Voss had ever heard. It was not a roar, nor the mechanical groan of a ship coming apart. It was chittering, a discordant, layered clicking, as though hundreds of mandibles or metallic limbs scraped against the walls of reality itself. Voss barely had time to react before the ship trembled again, more violently this time. Overhead, failing light panels flickered, their glow pulsing like a dying heartbeat. A distant bulkhead slammed shut somewhere in the ship, cutting off whatever remained of the failing life support systems. The Zepharan survivor struggled against his own. Failing body, his exoskeletal fingers gripping Voss's arm with surprising strength. His mandibles parted, voice hoarse but desperate. You brought them. The words sent a chill through Voss. We didn't bring anything, he said. But even as the words left his mouth, he realized the Zepharan's meaning. The Omnith were already here. A metallic thud reverberated through the ship, closer this time. The team snapped into formation, rifles raised. Shadows twitched at the edges of their helmet lights. The air, already thin from the ship's failing systems, grew suffocatingly still. Then, something moved in the corridor ahead. A shape. A limb. No. Many limbs. The Zepharan hissed in pain and panic, his body convulsing as he tried to speak. They change. They change. They... A shadow exploded from the darkness. A blur of black chitin and sharpened limbs slammed into the nearest marine, its movement too fast, too unnatural. Sergeant Harlow barely had time to react before the thing was on him, serrated claws tearing through reinforced armor like it was paper. Blood sprayed in a crimson arc. Gunfire erupted in the corridor, filling the air with bursts of muzzle flashes and searing plasma bolts. The strobing light revealed glimpses of the creature. A shifting, skeletal mass of interlocking plates. Its elongated limbs too many, too flexible, too wrong. It should have died under the sheer weight of concentrated fire. But instead of falling, the thing moved differently, its body contorted, snapping apart and reassembling in unnatural ways, as if its own biology was rewriting itself mid-motion. The Zepharan had spoken the truth. They adapted. Voss made a choice in an instant. Fall back, he bellowed, gripping the Zepharan and hauling him to his feet. Now, back to the docking bay. The Marines moved with the sharp discipline of veterans, retreating in controlled bursts of covering fire. Plasma bolts slammed into the creature, slowing it, but never fully stopping it. Behind them, more sounds echoed in the ship's depths. More scraping, more chittering, more things waking in the dark. They were not alone. The team raced through the crumbling ship, dragging the half-conscious Zepharan as the Omnith pursued. The ship's failing systems worked both for and against them. Sealed bulkheads blocked some paths, but also delayed the creatures. How far to the docking bay? Falk shouted between bursts of gunfire. 3 more junctions. Sykes, one of the engineers, yelled back. If the airlock holds, we can make it. Voss didn't slow his pace. No if. We make it. Behind them, the walls themselves seemed to shift. The Omnith didn't just chase. They hunted. They adapted. Limbs elongated, forming grasping talons that latched onto the ceiling. Bodies flattened, squeezing through spaces that should have been impassable. They moved without hesitation, learning with each second. The team burst into the final corridor leading to the airlock. The docking tube connecting them to the horizon was still intact. The moment they crossed the threshold, they could seal the hatch. Then Sykes screamed, An omnith had dropped from the ceiling behind them, its limbs reforming into barbed spears. One impaled Sykes through the chest, lifting him off the ground like a rag doll. His helmet visor splintered, blood misting against the glass. "Sykes!" Harlow fired in blind rage, his rifle's plasma discharge burning across the omnith's twisted form. The creature convulsed, then split apart into smaller segments, each scattering across the walls like cockroaches. Voss didn't hesitate. "Move, damn it! Move!" The team sprinted for the airlock. The Zypheran stumbled, and Falk grabbed his arm, dragging him forward. They reached the docking tube. "Seal it!" Voss barked. Harlow slammed the emergency release. The hatch hissed shut, the reinforced blast door locking into place, just as the corridor behind them collapsed into writhing horror. A moment of silence. Then, pounding. The signal collapsed into white noise. Cade clenched her jaw, tapping rapidly against her interface. "Captain, they're losing power. If we don't move now, they won't survive." Commander Nathan Sorev stepped forward. "Captain, I strongly advise against boarding that vessel. They could still be hostile. We have no idea if this is a setup." Voss's gaze didn't waver. "You saw the planet, Commander. You saw their ships. If this is a trap, it's the worst executed one I've ever seen." Sorev's expression hardened. "And if it's not? What if whatever did this is still out there? Watching?" Voss turned to Dr. Falk, who had been silently analyzing the wreckage outside. "What are the odds of enemy presence in this system?" She shook her head. "Scans aren't showing anything unusual. But if this omnith force is advanced enough to do this, they might have tech beyond what our sensors can detect." Another silence. Voss took a slow breath. "Prepare a boarding team." Sorev stiffened. "Sir." "That's an order, Commander." The words left no room for debate. Sorev exhaled sharply, but saluted. "Aye, Captain." Within minutes, the Horizon's docking bay was a flurry of movement. Marines armed in advanced exosuits loaded their weapons, preparing for whatever waited for them aboard the crippled Zypheran vessel. Engineers calibrated their equipment, ensuring they could patch into whatever systems remained functional. Medics strapped down emergency kits, anticipating the worst. At the center of it all, Captain Voss donned his own pressure suit, sealing the airtight helmet with a practiced motion. Sorev stood before him, arms crossed. "I still think this is reckless," Voss met his gaze. Noted. "You're going yourself? I don't send people into something I wouldn't walk into myself." Sorev sighed, rubbing his temple. "At least take me with you." "Not happening," Voss replied. "If this goes south, I need you here running the ship." The loading ramp extended, with a mechanical hiss, connecting to the docking tube of the derelict Zypheran vessel. Voss turned to his boarding team. 6 Marines, 2 engineers, 1 medic. "Standard breach formation, weapons free if threatened, but we are not here to make enemies. We are here to save them." One by one, they stepped into the airlock. The doors sealed behind them. The horizon faded from view. The Zypheran ship, once a proud war frigate, was barely holding together. Emergency lighting flickered in eerie intervals, casting long, broken shadows along the corridors. The moment the boarding team stepped inside, the overwhelming stench of burnt wiring and decomposing flesh seeped into their suits' external filters. "Christ," one of the Marines muttered. "Stay sharp," Voss ordered. They moved in disciplined formation, scanning every corridor, every collapsed bulkhead, every motionless body slumped against the walls. Some Zypherans had died where they stood, their weapons still clutched in lifeless hands. Others bore wounds that looked wrong. Voss crouched beside one of the corpses, studying the jagged, irregular tears running along its carapace-like skin. Zypherans were tough, harder to kill than a human in most cases. But this wasn't the result of gunfire or plasma. Burns. It looked like something had torn into them. A shuffling noise echoed from deeper within the ship. The team froze, weapons raised. "Movement ahead," one of the Marines whispered. Voss signaled for silence. Slowly, carefully, they advanced, stepping over fallen bodies, past malfunctioning consoles and exposed wiring sparking in the darkness. Then they saw him, the Zypheran survivor, slumped against a half-collapsed doorway, his once imposing form now gaunt and weak, sat a figure barely recognizable as one of the proud warrior race. His breathing was labored, his mandibles twitching as he struggled to lift a weapon far too heavy for his current state. The moment he saw the humans, his body tensed. His four-fingered grip tightened around the rifle. "Hold your fire," Voss said, lowering his own weapon. He took a cautious step forward, hands visible. "We're here to help." The Zifferan's eyes burned with something between hatred and desperation. His exoskeletal frame shuddered as he tried to push himself up, only to collapse again. "You should not have come," he rasped. Dr. Falk knelt beside him, running her scanner along his form. "Oxygen deprivation, internal hemorrhaging. He's dying." The Zifferan let out a bitter, rattling sound that might have been laughter. "We are already dead." Voss crouched beside him. "What happened here?" The Zifferan's gaze flickered, unfocused. Then, after a long, shuddering breath, he whispered, "One word: adaptation." Before Voss could ask what that meant, the ship trembled. A low, mechanical hum reverberated through the hull. The team exchanged wary glances. "That wasn't us," one Marine said, gripping his rifle tighter. Then, a new sound joined the hum. Something moving. Falk folded her arms, her gaze shifting to the stars. "I keep asking myself why the Zifferans would reach out to us. They're proud, stubborn. If they had any other choice, they would have taken it." "Which means they've run out of choices," Voss said. Falk nodded. "Exactly. And that terrifies me." They both fell silent, watching the distant glow of a dying star flicker in the distance. The Zifferans had been a warrior race, their fleets once the terror of human space. For them to surrender, to beg for help, it was unnatural. The question lingered between them, unspoken, yet undeniable. What kind of enemy had broken them so completely? The intercom crackled. "Captain, we're approaching Valara 7, dropping out of FTL in 60 seconds. Voss straightened. The moment of contemplation was over. "Time to see what kind of nightmare we've stepped into," he muttered, turning on his heel. The horizon snapped back into real space with a ripple of light, emerging at the edge of the Valara system. At first, all seemed eerily quiet. Then the devastation came into focus. Valara 7 hung below them like a wounded animal, bleeding fire into the void. Entire continents were burning, their once great cities reduced to little more than smoldering embers. Great rifts, unnatural in shape, carved through the planet's crust, as if something had burrowed into the very bones of the world. And orbiting above it, in the shattered graveyard of its defense fleet, floated the ruins of what had once been one of the most powerful armadas in the known galaxy. Zifferan warships, once sleek and deadly, now drifted in silence, their hulls torn open, their crews long dead. Some of the wreckage still carried the faint signature of energy discharges, as if whatever had destroyed them had done so with methodical precision. The bridge of the horizon was frozen in silent horror. Even Commander Sorev, a veteran of too many battles, had nothing to say. Lieutenant Cade's voice wavered slightly as she broke the silence. "Scanning for survivors. I'm picking up faint energy signatures. There are still Zifferan ships, intact. Barely. Sending hails now." A tense pause. The crew held their breath. Then, the response came, not in the form of words, but a jagged, panicked burst of static. It took a moment before the translation software was able to make sense of it. "Unknown vessel, human vessel, do you come in war?" Cade glanced at Voss, awaiting his order. He stepped forward, his voice calm, controlled. "Zifferan ship, this is Captain Elias Voss of the UES Horizon. We received your distress call. We are here to help." Another pause, filled with the quiet, crackling of a failing transmission. Then, a different voice, weaker, but firm. "If you are here to help, then we are already dead." Voss exchanged a look with Falk. The horror in that voice, the raw fear, it wasn't something he expected to hear from a Zifferan. The warriors of Valara 7 had once prided themselves on their defiance, but this was the voice of a people already defeated. "Who did this to you?" he asked. A moment of silence, then the reply. "The Omnith. They have no mercy, no soul. They are coming. If you do not leave now, you will die screaming as we have. The transmission cut off. On the bridge, the crew was silent. Only the distant crackle of energy fields and the cold hum of the ship's systems filled the air. Omnith, Falk whispered. I've never heard of them. Voss exhaled sharply. Neither have I. Outside the viewport, beyond the drifting wreckage of a fallen empire, the dark void stretched endlessly ahead. And somewhere in that darkness, whatever had done this was still out there, waiting. The silence on the bridge of the UES horizon was suffocating. Every officer, every crew member, stood frozen in place, absorbing the weight of the Zepharan's final words. The Omnith. They have no mercy, no soul. They are coming. If you do not leave now, you will die screaming as we have. A race they had never heard of had torn through one of the most war-hardened species in the galaxy, leaving only wreckage and desperation in its wake. Even at the height of their conflict with humanity, the Zepharans had never begged, and yet, that was exactly what had happened here. Captain Elias Voss let the words settle before he spoke. Lieutenant Cade, try to re-establish contact. Get me that ship. Cade's fingers flew over her console, eyes scanning the data feed. Trying, sir, but their signal is weak. The transmission. Static exploded through the bridge speakers. A low, rattling voice broke through the interference, barely audible over what sounded like distant alarms. We do not have time for words. If you will help, come now. We are failing. Hull breach. Oxygen at 7%. The bridge of the UES horizon was quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of its instruments. Captain Elias Voss stood at the center, arms crossed, his sharp eyes locked onto the holographic display that flickered above the command console. The signal had come without warning, an ancient emergency frequency, one rarely used and even less frequently answered. Lieutenant Mira Cade, the ship's communications officer, glanced up from her console. It's on a loop, Captain. Automated, encoded, in a language we haven't seen in years. Voss didn't need to ask which language. He already knew. It had been carved into war reports and whispered in the dark corners of military strategy rooms back on Earth. It belonged to the Zepharans, a race that had once waged brutal war against humanity. That war had ended 2 decades ago, not with victory, but with a cold, uneasy ceasefire. A few officers on the bridge shifted uncomfortably. The name alone brought memories of burned-out colonies, ambushes in deep space, and ships lost to the void. The Zepharans were not allies, and yet, here they were, reaching out with a distress call. Play it, Voss ordered. The transmission crackled. Through the speakers, distorted but unmistakably desperate, a guttural voice, weak and strained, spoke in broken standard. Survivors. We are hunted. Valara 7 burns. They do not stop. We surrender. We beg. Help. Then silence. No demands, no threats, no conditions. Just a plea. Voss exhaled slowly. The weight of the decision ahead pressed against his chest like the pull of a collapsing star. Every instinct told him to ignore it, to let the ghosts of an old enemy fade into the void. But something about the message gnawed at him. The Zepharans were warriors to their core. Proud. Unyielding. For them to beg for help meant they had seen something far worse than war. A deep voice cut through the silence. Commander Nathan Sorev, the ship's tactical officer, leaned forward. Captain, we don't owe them anything. They made their choice when they invaded our worlds. Let whatever's hunting them finish the job. That would be the safe choice, Voss admitted. His gaze drifted to the holographic map now displaying Valara 7, the Zepharan homeworld. It was marked with red indicators, signs of devastation, orbital, debris, failing infrastructure. But if they're afraid, if they're running, we should be asking ourselves what could make them run. Dr. Lillian Falk, the ship's xenostrategist, frowned as she studied the readings. Valara 7 wasn't supposed to fall this quickly. If an enemy could break them this fast, they might not stop there. The bridge fell silent again. They all knew what she meant. If the Zepharans could be wiped out in a matter of weeks, then whatever was responsible might not stop with them. Voss turned back to Cade. How far are we? 3 jumps. We'd be there in less than a day, she answered. It wasn't far. But it was far enough that Earth Command wouldn't be able to give them orders. In time, Sorev shook his head. Captain, this could be a trap. We arrive, and they open fire the moment we drop out of warp. Maybe, Voss admitted. He looked around at his officers, the men and women who had followed him through countless battles. They had seen what he had seen, fought where he had fought. He could see the same question in their eyes. If it were us, he said, voice steady. If Earth was burning, if our people were begging for help, even from an old enemy, would we want them to ignore us? A heavy silence settled over the bridge. No one spoke. Then, finally, Mira Cade gave a slow nod. Course plotted, Captain. Voss straightened. There was no going back now. Take us to Valara 7. The UES horizon slipped through the fabric of space, a steel leviathan cutting across the void at faster-than-light speeds. Within its reinforced hull, the ship's crew moved with the precise urgency of those who understood they were heading toward the unknown. The Zepharans, humanity's old enemy, had called for help, and now the fate of thousands, perhaps millions, hung in the balance. Captain Elias Voss stood at the observation deck, hands clasped behind his back, watching the swirling nebulae drift beyond the ship's reinforced glass. Despite the quiet hum of the horizon's powerful engines, his mind was anything but still. Valara 7 lay only hours away, and yet every fiber of his being told him that what they would find there would be unlike anything they had encountered before. Footsteps approached. "You're brooding again?" Dr. Lillian Falk observed as she stepped up beside him. The ship's chief xenostrategist was one of the few people aboard who dared speak to him so plainly. Voss didn't look at her. "Wouldn't you be?"